So this is our introduction to family history that we often give when we're asked to talk about general parameters of what it is to do family history research. And as I go through these, I just want to say it's not a step-by-step, but kind of an overview. It's a kind of a um, survey of the different types of records that are important and how to sort the noise from the valuable information that you find. I want to begin by discussing a recent evolution in the universe of family history research, a set of changes that has both benefited and handicapped good research practices and sound research results. I never thought I'd see the day that family history would become big business, but it certainly has evolved into that over the past couple of decades. Of course, for some time we've had a pretty healthy genealogical publishing industry, including now on-demand options, but the field used to be the province of amateurs and enthusiasts who were willing to travel long distances and go to practically any lengths to find that golden nugget of information that they needed to complete their research with no hope of material reward. They mined records in archives and files in local libraries. They scanned through reels and reels of microfilm with or without indexes, and they browsed published books of abstracts for hours. They wrote queries and letters to fellow researchers, and they were actually willing to wait more than a couple of days for a reply. They searched through thick undergrowth to find long abandoned gravestones and home sites, and they were willing to contact remote relatives they had never met in order to find that precious letter, photograph, or other memento of bygone years. It took lots of time, lots of patience, but it seemed worthwhile because of the payoff. And what was that payoff? Well, it was a sense of belonging to and being rooted in a particular group of people, a particular place, and a particular culture. And, we need that reassurance now more than ever, when so many live far removed from their geographical and cultural origins. But our society is one in which the architecture of information and the expectations that go along with that have changed dramatically. Whereas once local genealogical societies and small publishers covered practically every corner of the country, producing published works that reflected a deep familiarity with the names, places, and events of that area, now data aggregators, like our major websites, are absorbing more and more consumer dollars with the illusion of a comprehensive family history collection, to the point that you can scarcely turn on the television without seeing a family history related advertisement or sponsorship. Local and state genealogical societies are fading quickly for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is the false impression created by many websites that genealogy can be quick and easy, demanding little more than a subscription and a quickie search from the comfort of your home office or bedroom. The internet has made possible instant communication between relatives working on the same families through message boards or email, social media like Facebook and other social networking platforms. And the results have been stunning for many people. But the ease of finding the low-hanging fruit has prevented folks from making an effort to uncover many other priceless resources that remain less accessible, including contacting people who are not that interested in family history or connected to the internet, but who do have family treasures to share. It's also given genealogical misinformation the chance to spread and multiply at the speed of a keystroke or a mouse click. Now AI is providing resources to read and digest sources and guidebooks for us. It's able to help us write clearer prose. It's even able, with training, to provide full text searching for record groups that are still handwritten and that have never been transcribed or abstracted before. Finally, cheaper and more reliable DNA testing has provided researchers with an opportunity to explore more remote degrees of ancestry and kinship in spite of missing paper trails. But for some, the paper trail has been devalued because of that. And I'm here to tell you that DNA is not a panacea. Your results will mean very little without first doing a lot of traditional genealogical research to put it into context. So we have more tools than ever. And who can complain about that? Tools are actually neutral. Most of us have greatly benefited from them. But if we don't truly understand how they are put together or how they work and their limitations, we can also fall victim to the illusion of comprehensiveness and omniscience. Don't get me wrong. I make use of and enjoy the results these applications and websites yield on a daily basis. It's just that the illusion of speed and accuracy can make us complacent when we don't know any better. And sad to say, it can also make us very lackadaisical, to the point that we just don't know or care what we are missing because of our desire for speed and convenience. There's so much more detail that's being overlooked, so many records that lie languishing because folks don't know they exist, and these websites have not given them much attention. Many sources have never been imaged or microfilmed, for example, much less digitized. Some are still in private hands and have to be sought out proactively by interfacing with real human beings. Human indexing and even AI-generated indexing frequently misses a name or mistakes one name for another. You cannot simply ask AI questions about your genealogy and expect to get accurate answers. It only knows what it has consumed. It's very bad at analyzing, evaluating, collating even that information, keeping the relevant information and throwing out the irrelevant. As you do, for instance, if you want to distinguish between two different people with the same name from one another. AI will usually not be able to make that distinction. And it will often hallucinate. It will fill in the blanks with random facts or lie to you to make you happy. That's because it is programmed to interface with humans and please them in order to strengthen and prolong the interaction. Indexes on Ancestry, for example, often skip many images contained within them, whole volumes of records, in fact, that are there in image form, but cannot be instantaneously searched, even though that search box makes it look like it covers the entire group of records. And this is particularly true of marriage records and probate records, I've found, within my area of expertise in North Carolina. Often when people are searching ancestry databases, they think Ancestry itself is the source, when actually each database takes its information from an earlier publication or a record set created by a government, usually for purposes that were far removed from genealogical interest. There's no excuse for us to be ignorant about our sources, because only when we know what they are and how the information was put together can we evaluate how accurate and useful it is. So today, what I'm going to do is take you through a whirlwind tour of the basic sources to use when you're doing your family history research and when you're first beginning it, and to give you some overall pointers about how best to conduct your research. All those things that I wish I had known before I started but didn't. I'll also give you some go-to places to learn more about each source in depth. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about our library and what we offer here to people who actually come in or who contact us. So the first thing that we usually do is we have someone fill out a lineage chart with what they already know. Whether you use software to produce your chart or old-fashioned paper and pencil, note down key events, dates, and places, birth, marriage, and death places and dates, and full names. You want to put maiden names for females. Each bracket is a couple. So my parents are the first bracket to the left on this sheet, and then my grandparents are in the next generation. Paternal ancestor on top, maternal ancestor on bottom. The females always maiden names and full names for everybody, because you never know when someone went by a different name, like their middle name, at a different stage in their life. If you know any nicknames, you might want to note that down here as well, because those can also appear in actual records. I wrote this in pencil because I wanted to be prepared to make changes later. This is a skeletal outline and guide to your future research, helping you to define what you already know and where your blanks are, what you don't know, and what you should try to find out. Plot a research strategy to discover the missing facts. The chart does not qualify as a family history in and of itself, though. You'll want to add layers of detail about these folks for a truly satisfying research experience. Be sure to speak to the oldest living relatives in your family. Get them to help you extend the information on your chart. But don't restrict your inquiries to mere names and dates. Set aside time to talk at length. And maybe set up more than one interview, because you'll think of things later that you'll have forgotten or didn't have time for the first time around, or when you go back to review your notes or your transcription of what you just got that first session. Discuss major historical events, occupations, immigration and migration, military service, religious affiliation, the character and life experiences of people that they have known in their families, photographs, family letters, Bibles. Make time to share that. Have them share what they have, their physical items with you. If they don't have them, where are they located? Who has them? Who might be prepared to share them with you or not? Plan your interview and record it in some way, preferably through audio recording, digital media recording, so that you can revisit it from time to time for implications and details that you might have missed. You know now that transcriptions are very easily done automatically. You don't have to do those manually through that system of recording. Much of what your older relative can tell you, you'll never find in any public record, and that's what makes this stage of the research so special. Public records are a poor substitute for this oral chain of transmission because they only deal with the public aspects of life and those with which the law has an interest and the government has an interest. And that's a very small portion of what our lives are about as human beings. And as you will discover, so many details are missed by legal authorities, particularly if a family is poor, unfree, or records either weren't required or were lost in the places where your ancestors lived. If only we had time machines so that we could interview all of our deceased ancestors, how much more we would know about them than we could ever possibly get through the poor substitute that public records provide us. That would be the ultimate genealogy tool. Now, once you know the locales where your immediate ancestors resided, prepare to find out more about those places. Obtain and read local histories. Very often, notes about families are included in these histories, but more importantly, if you actually read them, you will get a feel for what it was like to live in those times and places, what types of people settled there, the places from which they came, what the land and the economy were like at different stages, and how that developed over time, the conditions under which inhabitants lived in different periods of history, and the major events that they had to deal with: war, crop blights, weather catastrophes that may have happened, the coming of a new factory to the area, how a town developed and how the streets were laid out over time and as it expanded. All those things are things you'll want to know before you start your actual research. That it gives you context and helps you know which questions you want to ask and where you want to look for various pieces of information. Then you also want to know, beyond the history, something about the records that existed in that particular place. The types and the contents of records change with different historical periods, as do forms and agencies of government. You need to know what kind of record is most likely to answer the question that you have about particular people in your family at a particular time. If the answer isn't in that record, or that record does not exist, you're going to need to know what other records might possibly serve as a fallback. Finally, you want to know where all of these records are located and how to get to access to them today. Remember that some records have been lost due to fire, flood, exposure to vermin and the elements, war, or just plain carelessness. There are a variety of record guides to many different states that you can use. The Family Search website has brief record guides for various locations. There's a good overview of South Carolina records that Brent Holcomb produced some years ago. It's called A Guide to South Carolina Research and Records. And there are meteor guides to North Carolina and Virginia research, like in the case of North Carolina, Helen Leary's North Carolina research. It's unparalleled. It can't really be beat even today. And Carol McGinnis's Virginia genealogy for Virginia. And we also in libraries can do something to help you educate you about the jurisdictions that we're familiar with. So don't overlook the expertise that you have in your local librarian. You don't need to become an expert right away at all this stuff, but you will need a ready reference like the books that I'm talking about or the short guides to answer questions as they arise and help plan your research trips and plans of attack on various questions. And then, very importantly, you're going to find that as you continue this work, what you collect piles up. And it may not be physical items like what you see on these shelves. It may be digital items, but you need to get prepared and set up before you even start a system so that you can retrieve everything that you want from all the material that you've collected over time. And you can use some really good computer programs to help you do that. Evernote is a great example of that. Get yourself something like that if you're really into the digital aspect of it. You can also scan items and make them into digital files. You can create nested folders, etc. But settle on a method to file and store what you gather before you begin. You can file it by family and county or record type. Modern genealogical database software allows you to add sources and documents to individuals in your family tree database, which you could do online or you can do through a program that you've downloaded to your computer or your device. So this is a good way to go if you're handy with a scanner. Just remember to always have backup copies of your database on memory sticks, cloud servers, or backup drives. The advantage of paper is that it doesn't disappear when your computer fails. Also, if you use a genealogy software program, you never know when the software producer will go out of business or abandon the program so that it's not updated anymore and protected from threats. It's not always easy to transfer ancillary information attached to individuals from one software program to another. Broaden your research. Make copies or take notes of everything that seems relevant to you, even if you don't really know how to fit it into your research yet. Later on, when more information is gathered, it will begin to fall into place. Don't focus only on your known ancestors. Pay attention to all people carrying that surname in the geographical area you're studying. Don't just trace directly up the family tree. Trace your collateral relatives as well, the uncles and aunts, and maybe the first cousins as well. Sometimes clues for finding more direct ancestors can only be located down collateral lines. Remember, they've also inherited stuff from your common lineage and knowledge as well as documents, for example. So you want to know who they are. Always note the source of what you've uncovered as you go along from the very beginning, whether that be the name of the database you got it from, a courthouse record, a book, a certificate number, or what have you. And when you're using Ancestry, be sure not just to say that you got it from Ancestry, but what database and what that database draws upon for its ultimate source. What primary source record did that database draw all this information from, and where is it located? Now, tracking the source might not seem important to you now, especially when you're very eager to keep moving forward. But later you may want to revisit the information or tell someone else where it is. You, for example, may find out that you relied upon a transcription or an index, and you somehow think that the indexer got something wrong, and you want to go back and look at the original and confirm if it really says what that person said it says, or what that computer program or AI program says that it said. Standard information to include in your references are title, author, publisher, date, page or item number, website address with the date that you accessed it, because the web is a moving target, as we know, record group, date, box number, repository, and location. And there are templates you can use and websites you can use to help you do a proper citation, but you really don't need that much of a proper citation so much as the basic information of where you got it from, so that you can go back and build one if you need to later. Keep a research log which shows that what you did during various research sessions, so you know never to repeat searches that you've already conducted. And believe me, eventually you'll forget what you've already done, and you'll waste time if you don't keep track of what you've done. So do your future self a favor. So now let's plunge right on in to the basic record types that you'll be using, starting with the most fundamental, the ones that most researchers start their research with. And what is more fundamental than the United States Census? It's the most common starting point because it describes individual households in some detail in a snapshot way every 10 years. Record availability begins in 1950 and goes backwards in time, continuing all the way back to 1790, with the exception of 1 year. And that 1 year where we don't have very many surviving census records is 1890. So there we have a 20-year gap. But otherwise, we have 10-year intervals, snapshots of America, who was living where in every household, what their ages were, and so forth. Now, the information does vary from year to year that's included in the census, but the general trend is that more recent records are more informative and older ones are less so. However, I think maybe the exception to that is 1950. When I compare 1950 to 1940 and before, I feel a little let down. It's useful to get the snapshot of the family every 10 years. It's helpful in finding the parents and grandparents, at least back to 1850 census. It's helpful in showing ages, places of birth, rough estimates for dates of marriage, migration, and naturalization, and revealing occupations and addresses. You can find out what road your ancestor lived on in a country area. You can find out what street, very often. You can find out what township within a larger county your ancestor lived in. And that's all very useful. And a township, by the way, is not necessarily a town per se, but just a division, a geographical division of a county, into which all counties were divided after 1870. Sometimes the earlier records show you what post office the family's living nearest. It's helpful in showing the migration patterns of various branches of the family, since census records are searchable nationwide on several different websites, including Family Search and Ancestry. The indexes are not always completely accurate. A 1950, for example, seems a little bit less accurate than I'm used to, and it's very more difficult to find people in it. And that may be because AI was involved in indexing so much of it and was only kind of spot checked by actual living human beings. Don't forget supplementary schedules of the census that are frequently overlooked as well and give you even more information, like the agricultural census or the industrial census, the social statistics schedule, the slave schedules, and mortality schedules. Those have specific applications, like, for instance, the agricultural census. Most of our ancestors at some point were working on farms. You can find out a lot about that farm and what they were producing on each farm in those agricultural schedules from 1850 forward. The industrial schedule, if you have an ancestor who had a factory or maybe a shop where they were producing anything like barrels or they were doing some kind of woodworking, furniture making, That will be in the industrial schedule, and you can find out what kind of products they had on hand and raw materials and all that. Very interesting stuff. And that stuff is, those schedules, those supplementary schedules, are often not easily available on any of these websites that we use all the time. You kind of have to sometimes even go to the microfilm, depending on what the location is, for some of this material, which is extremely interesting. Social statistics schedules can sometimes deal with people who are infirm in some way or institutionalized. Slave schedules, of course, list all the people who were owned by a slaveholder, but not by name, by sex, by age, by race. Tells you how many cabins there were housing the enslaved people on a particular plantation. And mortality schedules look back at the previous year or so before the June mid-year period where the census day was located, and tells you who died in a particular family within the previous 12 months, going back, let's say if it's 1850 into mid-1849, or if it's 1870 into mid-1869. And that's really, really interesting and helpful when you don't have, a church record showing you when someone was buried, or giving the cause of death, or a death certificate. Really irreplaceable. Now, I want to make some cautions here. Census records were created by individuals traveling door to door, so accuracy depends on how familiar the census taker was with the neighborhood, how intelligible the accents of the people interviewed were to that census taker or marshal, the degree to which people who met them at the door had accurate information or were willing to reveal it. And search engines created for websites are often full of transcription errors, so it can be difficult to find your ancestor without trying several different strategies, and we can help you with that if you are having difficulty. It's a rare thing. It's not unheard of, but it's rare when a person lived in a particular place but is not in the census. Very often they are there, but something is wrong. The name has been misread, or they've been put under a different name than you expected. Or they could just be in a situation where, my mother, for example, remarried, and the family is all under that surname rather than the one that you were looking for. In this case, I was going to show you a few census records related to my Cates ancestors, beginning in 1910 in Burlington, Alamance County, North Carolina, where my great-grandfather, William M. Cates, is living with his wife, Ednora, and his eldest son, William M. Jr. And then also living there is someone named Zareta Hamilton, and that turns out to be, as it says in the relationship line, his sister-in-law. All the relationships are to the head of the household, and her daughter is also living there. It gives us not only their ages and their gender and their race, where they were born, where their father was born, where their mother was born, but the occupation. We see that he was a furniture salesman, and that his, also it tells us how long people have been married, whether it's their first marriage or not, whether they are unmarried or widowed or divorced, how many children a woman has given birth to up to that point, and how many were born alive of those, how many of those are still alive of those that were born alive. So, for example, my great-grandmother Ednora had given birth to 2 children so far, and one of them was deceased. And actually, we do know who that child was from other sources. Now, one of my really big mysteries is where my William Cates came from and who his parents were. We didn't really know as a family because he died in 1911, just 1 year after that previous census was taken. So I wanted to trace him back and find out who his parents were. And I found that he was living with his wife already in 1900, 10 years before the previous image, in Durham, actually, the township of Durham, which is quite a distance from where Ednora Ruth was born, his wife. It was a mystery to me exactly how she met him. At this point, they'd only been married a year, and records show that they were actually married in Durham itself. So for some reason, she was there, as was he. Now, I told you that the 1890 census is missing. So what do I use to bridge that gap? Well, fortunately, William Mitchell Cates, my great-grandfather, was born before 1880, so he should be in somebody's household in 1880. And sure enough, I did find him. And back in the day when I found this record, I had to actually look sort of at every Cates household that I could find in a printed index to find him here. It was actually, I think, a Soundex that I used, a different reel that was generated at the time by the Census Bureau to provide access to these records by the persons in it, their names alphabetically. I was able to find him here in Orange County, North Carolina, next door to what later became Durham County, with his father, John, and his mother, Eliza. Her maiden name was Reeves, and there were all these children. In fact, I found out that he was kind of the middle child in a family of 16 children, believe it or not. Most of these children ended up in Durham, so he was not the only one there by 1900, and many of them stayed in Durham. They had to leave the farm because it's this period in history where our farm economy is being replaced by an urban economy driven by industry. And going further back, now that I know about John and Eliza, I wanted to find them in the previous censuses, and indeed I did find them. Here is John E. Cates living with his wife Eliza, whom he had married within the previous decade, it appears, around 1861. And there are his oldest children that kind of match the ages. If you add 10 years, they pretty much match what we saw in 1880. But I didn't just look at him, I looked at other people that were around him. And indeed, because it's sort of a rural, family-focused culture that we're dealing with here, we have lots of kin in the neighborhood. So it's always important when you're using census records to look at the neighbors and consider whether they might be of some relationship, especially if there's a consistency of their appearing from year to year in that same vicinity. In his own household, now the numbers on the left divide one household from another. It begins with the head of household and then everybody underneath that lives there. But in his own household is a woman named Nancy C. Reeves. And in fact, when I did more research with other sources, I found out she was living with them because she was Eliza's mother. Eliza was a Reeves, Eliza Jeanette Reeves, before she married John E. Cates. And this is her mother, Nancy, who's a widow. She later went to Tennessee with another of her children. And Eliza was her only child by Frederick Reeves, who'd been married previously and had many other children. But also nearby are other Cates families. There's Henry Cates, whom I suspect was maybe the uncle of John E. Cates. There's Washington P. Roberts, who married the sister of John E. Cates, and Martha Carr, in fact, who was also a sister of John E. Cates, with her family. And then at the very bottom, there's somebody called Sanders William Cates, who's 53 years old in 1870, and his wife Susan. And as I would later discover from other records, these are John E. Cates's parents. So already I'm back to my great-great-great-grandparents through this record. That's really exhilarating when the census can do that for you within, just a few searches. You get a little intoxicated with that, but you don't know these people yet. You know very little. The census is not a substitute for all the other research that you need to do. Now, the next stage that people are usually consumed with when they're starting their research is the use of vital records. So here we're talking about birth certificates, death certificates, marriage registers, bonds and licenses, and records of divorce. With the exception of marriages, often these don't begin to become available in great numbers before the 20th century. They may contain considerable misinformation, but also great clues. For instance, they help to document medical history. What did the person die of? Parentage. Each of these documents usually has a place for recording the parents of the principal parties, either the person who died or was born, or the person who got married. Very frequently has to give the name of the parents for both the bride and the groom. Crucial dates that have to do with our lifespan, as our birth, our marriage dates, our divorce dates, and our dates of remarriage, our dates of death. The length of the illness that led to death can also appear in a death certificate. There are places of interment on death certificates. There are places of origin or residence. There are details of family life, in divorce petitions particularly, that we might not get anywhere else, because in the old days, divorce was not no fault. It was for cause. It's well represented. These records are well represented in online databases, though original records are often more informative than the abstracts online or the digested versions online. The originals are usually in a local county office. In North Carolina, that office would be the Register of Deeds office, but it could be at the Department of Health. It could be at the local level, or it could be at the state level, or both. And we must remember that vital records are not infallible. They're only reliable as reliable as the person who gave the information. And usually that person is identified on the form, so we can kind of judge by what we know of that person whether we should take this literally or not. This is the marriage certificate of my grandfather, John Wayne Cates, when he married my grandmother, Helen Johnson. And it looks like their marriage actually took place in Guilford County, where I am right now, even though they didn't really live in Guilford County for much of their lives. I think my grandmother worked here. They give their ages, they give their race, they give the parents' names of each and whether they're alive or dead. For my grandfather, both of his parents were already dead by the time he got married. For my grandmother, they were both alive and living in the neighboring county of Randolph in the little place called Liberty. My grandfather's signature is on this document, and my grandmother's signature as well. And at the bottom is the date they actually got married, who married them. They were married in the ME Church, and the date they were married. Their witnesses are also listed, and we know that witnesses can be friends or they can actually be family members. The residences of the witnesses are also given. Every clue is important. Now, this is an earlier form of marriage record in North Carolina for my great-great-grandparents, John Cates and Eliza Reeves. Indeed, we estimated from the census that they would have been married about 1861, and that is when they were married, the 19th of January, 1861. Now, you'll note that there's only those two names, a date, which isn't really the date of a marriage, it's the date of this marriage bond. And the bond is not actually proof of marriage. It just shows us that a marriage between these two was contemplated. And if you note the language of a bond, it says they were indebted, these two men who signed this bond were indebted to the state of North Carolina in the sum of $1,000 to be void on condition that there's no lawful cause to obstruct a marriage between these two parties. So that means that if for some reason they get married and it turns out, and it would be sometime after this date, and it turns out that they were not legally able to be married, my grandfather who signed this bond and his bondsman, Mr. Crabtree, would be liable for $1,000 penalty to the state of North Carolina. And that's what that means. This is the type of marriage process that prevailed in North Carolina up until 1861. And it is, as I said before, not proof of marriage. It's a little bit inadequate, but it does give us a sense that two people were going to be married, intended to be married. It tells us the name of someone who was a close friend or relative of the groom or the bride, who was willing to put up, potentially a risk in case the marriage turned out to be illegal. In this case, it was Mr. Crabtree, and I do not know that he's related to John Cates. Maybe he was just a close friend of John Cates. And also, we have to keep in mind that that was not the only way to get married before 1868, and that maybe half or more of all marriages never involved a bond at all. They were simply declared their intention for 3 successive Sundays in a row through their minister that they intended to be married, and if there's anybody here who knows a reason why they cannot be legally married, that gave those people in church an opportunity to object. That was what that process was all about, and there was no civil record at all of such marriages. So a lot of our marriages are undocumented in North Carolina because no bond was ever involved. And here's an example of a death certificate for my grandmother, Eliza Cates, who was born a Reeves. Note that it gives her cause of death, where she died, the date of her death, her race, her sex, her marital status at the time. She was already widowed. Her husband had already died some 10 years earlier. A date of birth for her, which could be accurate, may not be accurate. This is not recording her birth so much as it's recording her death. It's more of a primary source record for her death and a secondary source record for her birth. By the same token, it tells us where she was born, the names of her parents, where she's to be buried. Now, when it comes to the names of the parents, that again is not primary source information. The person giving this information was her son Clarence. And he said that her father was named Lucius Reeves and her mother was named Elizabeth Smith, when in fact her father was named Frederick Reeves and her mother was named Nancy Smith. So those are kind of wrong, and he was mixing up some names because that's actually Lucius is the name of her brother, Lucius Smith. He remembered that name but misapplied it. And now we come to one of the very, very basic and crucial categories of records. Probate records, wills and estate records, they're more commonly called. They document the disposition of property when a person dies. They include wills and estate files. They include some legal records, court-related records, administration records, records of guardianship. They give information about heirs who may or may not be children of the deceased, property ownership, disputes over inheritance, the debts owed by and to the estate, the people who purchased or received property related to the estate. When you do not know the parents of an individual, a blanket search of all the probate records pertaining to that person's surname in the area is always a good first step in trying to determine who the parents were. You have to know the law related to distribution of property prevailing at the time and place that these individuals died. And that takes us back to the record guides that we were discussing earlier. They're often absent for people who have very little property, however. Probate records are increasingly available online, but there are significant gaps. Don't neglect to locate them in courthouses and state archives if you don't find them online. But Family Search and Ancestry.com are very helpful in this regard. Sometimes their indexing is incomplete, but that's going to change with time. Even for people who don't have a lot of property, however, we have to remember they did business with people who have property. They owed debts to people who had property. They leased land from people who had property. And all that comes up in the records of the people that they were associating with and joins them together. For example, when someone dies, all of their personal property, especially the part that's likely to go to waste, is sold almost immediately to raise money. And that's the first step in raising money to pay off debts, etc. So the neighbors come through and they come to these sales and they buy goods secondhand at auction. That very often includes a lot of people who are relatively poor, people who don't have a lot. They have to do with secondhand goods. So if you see several people with the same name or connected to the same family attending at an estate sale of a neighbor, that may be an indication that they are related to one another. Or if they get into debt together to a deceased person, on signing a note together. One is the surety of the other. That's another sign that they might be kin to one another. In this example that you see on the screen right now, we have the will of somebody named Daniel McCrae, distiller. He was called Daniel McCrae Stiller to distinguish him from all the other Daniel McCraes that lived in the PD section of the state of North Carolina. And here he talks about a lot of his grandchildren. He mentions a few children, but mostly he talks about his grandchildren in the provisions of his will. Leaves them land, leaves them enslaved people. And there are even relationships noted between the enslaved people. For example, he disposes of Katie and her children, Elijah and Matthew. He talks at the bottom about the woman Sook and her 4 children, Montfort, Rose, Harry, and Perry, and any future increase. So those are relationships among the enslaved people that are noted in the will of a former owner. Here is a petition within a loose estate file before the Equity Court of Guilford County to divide property or to sell it in order to pay for debts. And that had to involve all the heirs. So these are the heirs of someone named Peter Coble, who lately died. It says that he died about 2 months prior to the filing of this record. That gives us a certain insight into exactly when he died. And it gives a list of his heirs who are parties to this petition. And note, they're not necessarily suing one another. This is what we call an ex parte proceeding. You can even see ex parte below the list of names, which means it's a non-adversarial proceeding. It's just a pro forma proceeding to get this job done, to get the land or the other property sold or divided among them. Next, we have land records, which were recorded in deed books, in plat books, in mortgage books, and entry books, or exist as original papers in family collections, because when our ancestors obtained land, they also usually got the full range of deeds for that property all the way back to the land grant where it began, where the state or some other sovereign authority granted land to an individual that was considered vacant. It shows you when people acquired landed property and when they sold it. It assists you in identifying the neighbors and will help you map where ancestors lived to the point that you could potentially trace out the location today. It may help you find a burial site. It may help you track inheritance from earlier generations or suggest that neighbors with the same name or who married into that name were likely relatives. It may help you track when a person arrived in a particular area and when they left it, even where they moved afterwards, because sometimes a person will wait until they obtain land in a new place before they sell their land in an old place. And that deed might tell where they currently live. However, remember that not all deeds were recorded historically, didn't have to be recorded. All you had to do was keep the copy in your papers, and that was proof of your ownership. And that changed in North Carolina in the 1880s. It changes in different states at different times. Deed book copies can be inaccurate as well because they're actually copies, like the example that you see on your screen. This is the only original part is the image of the division of a set of land that belonged to Duncan McCrae, which was divided between the Dower tract, which is the largest tract, Mark Dower, to his widow and all of his children, his many children, getting little slivers off to the north and to the east of her tract along the river. The rest of it is typed, and the original documents, as we're talking about 1820 here, was not typed. I think what happened here was that the courthouse in Anson County caught fire in 1868, and a lot of the deed books were damaged, so they had to work through them and retype them to preserve them. However, whenever you make a copy, as you know, you make a mistake or two here or there. And the original deed is in the hands of the owner or the former owners of this property. If it exists today at all, which it most likely does not. The original deed book probably doesn't exist anymore. So we're talking about a copy of a copy. Online access varies for deeds from county to county, but Family Search basically has as much as they possibly can get for most counties of the deed books and their indexes. And more counties in North Carolina are digitizing their deeds and making them available through the Register of Deeds website. Now, military records, let's go to the beyond the basic records. These are records that are beyond the very core of what you start with, but will help you a little bit later down the road as you gather the details based on the first category we were just talking about. You gather and layer those on. Military records are an excellent source. They include draft registrations, bounty land records, individual service records, discharge records, and records of various military units and command structures, and pension records. They're mostly housed in the National Archives or the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, Missouri. Most of our military service has been at the national level, although there are records for the Adjutant General in the various states that command the militia or later the National Guard, and governor's records as well. When it comes to the National Personnel Records Center, which contained military records, a fire in the early 1970s destroyed many 20th century personnel service records from just before World War I until the 1960s. But there are some reconstituted files for some of those people drawn from other sources and the remnants of what was found after the fire. Some records, particularly Revolutionary War and Confederate records, may be found on the state level. In the 20th century, discharge records may have been filed in the county where the soldier resided immediately after the war. And databases online offer an extraordinary entry point for further investigation. Confederate and Revolutionary War records are fairly well covered on footnote.com, which is now Fold 3, by the way. In the old days it was called Footnote, but now it's Fold 3. And Ancestry as well. Ancestry has also indexes that cover some aspects of service for the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. Revolutionary War pensions and Confederate pensions are more readily accessible online than in the past, and the War of 1812 pensions at the federal level have, I think, all been covered now, or they're getting close to being all covered so that you can access them for free at Fold 3. Mexican War pensions still have to be ordered from the National Archives and Records Administration, as do regular Army pensions and Union pensions during the Civil War and many of the Indian Wars. And there are long wait times now in the post-pandemic era for those records when you order them, and they're quite expensive too. Records for 20th century wars are much harder to come by, and sometimes they are non-existent or reconstructed from pieces and other sources due to the NPRC fire that we mentioned earlier. However, I'll say that World War I is now better documented than ever because of our centenary that happened some 7 years ago at this point. We have many state-level lists of soldiers that were provided by the War Department to the various adjutants general of the various states, and we also have a lot of unit-level records once we find the unit involved that you can access on Family Search now. So let's talk briefly about the particular examples that we see here. This one is pretty obscure. It comes from North Carolina's Secretary of State military records. Now, the Secretary of State has very little to do with the military in North Carolina, with the militia. But in this case, because he controlled the land record, the land grant related records of the state, and the state gave land to individuals based on their military service in North Carolina if they served in the Continental Line. There's a whole category of Secretary of State papers in North Carolina having to do with Revolutionary War bounty land in Tennessee. This is one of several affidavits having to do with the service of Moses Estes, who was in the Continental Line and died during the service itself during the Revolutionary War. This affidavit was made by a neighbor who knew about that service, Joseph Weeks, and also about the only heirs being the children of the brother, the elder brother of the deceased soldier, Thomas Estes. And their names are also included among others of the papers. So they got his land grant out in Tennessee, his bounty land grant that their uncle earned because they were descended from the eldest brother of that uncle, who was childless when he died during the war. There's a card file of these records at the State Archives. As far as I know, they're not digitized. They're not to be found anywhere else at this point. Another relatively obscure category of records that can also be helpful to you are legislative and state agency records. They include petitions to legislative bodies by individuals and groups, sometimes for divorce or to subdivide counties, to provide needed legislation, to seek redress against corrupt officials, to legitimate children or change names, to liberate enslaved people when they were emancipated by their owners. You may be surprised, but the first divorces that granted in the state were totally within the purview of the legislature. So you had to get a petition together and explain your reasons to get a divorce, and there are many, many files of those that have been transcribed and indexed for us by the North Carolina Genealogical Society, and now they've been published. I don't think those are available on any of the websites that we've been talking about, the major aggregator websites. There are also state Supreme Court case files for cases appealed to the higher courts, which may cover anything a lower court needed clarification on. And those are very good substitutes for local records that are lost. Now the many, but not all, of the state Supreme Court files, which in previous days were only available in the state archives and indexed by the parties to the various cases in a card file there, they are now, they've been imaged, and many of them are online with Family Search, and they've also been run through that AI generated index. It's a wonderful way to get into those records. There's some very interesting cases there. Also, there are governor's papers, which often include correspondence from private citizens needing help. During the Civil War, for example, in North Carolina, Governor Zeb Vance got lots of requests for assistance from women whose husbands were off to war and who were having a lot of economic difficulty, from people wanting pardons for, court-martial for having left to go take care of something at home when they should have been with their unit, for various civil disturbances that occurred within North Carolina. So there are details on public disturbances in the governor's papers and people seeking pardons for crimes, like back when horse stealing was a capital offense. There were many petitions to the governor to pardon individuals, with neighbors declaring who was dependent on them and how good they otherwise had been during their life and how they deserved clemency. But there are pardons for enslaved people as well, and people who committed, aggravated I guess you'd call it second-degree murder that would have otherwise incurred a capital offense, and all kinds of other offenses. Also, there's state financial records, which cover obligations paid by the state to individuals, and Revolutionary Militia Service is often proved that way. State land grants being issued, and some tax lists for various locations. Most of those records, apart from the state Supreme Court records in North Carolina, are difficult to find online. In other states, even Supreme Court records may not be online. What you're looking at right here is an example taken from, of all things, North Carolina State Treasurer's and Comptroller's papers. The State Treasurer handling the monetary affairs of the state. In this case, during a short period during the late 1700s, 1780s, there was a period when all fees collected by county clerks had to be reported to the state treasurer, and that included fees for marriage licenses or marriage bonds like we were talking about earlier. And here is a list of bonds for the county of Montgomery, which lists both the name of the groom and the name of the bride, her maiden name. And we know about the time that this happened when they were reported. Because Montgomery County records were entirely burned, this is the only source we have for the marriage bonds that occurred there before 1843, when the last courthouse fire occurred. So this is a very precious list, and it happened to include the marriages of two of my ancestors, Colin McCrae and Finley McCrae, that I put the arrow next to at the bottom. So priceless. Found out about this through the North Carolina Genealogical Society, who published these. Here is a abstract of the divorce petition of John Johnson and his wife Peggy Barracks. Tells when they were married, all the circumstances that led to a rift between them, and gave us a list of the witnesses who support one person or the other in their cause. And here is a Supreme Court case file that revealed the paternity of Regina McCrae's daughter, who was born out of wedlock, and the circumstances under which that birth occurred. Her father sued the man who got her pregnant and claimed that because she had been pregnant, her labor, which he used in his hotel in Lawrenceville in Montgomery County, was lost to him, and thus the man owed him $1,000. And that's a very interesting case, very unusual case, and in a county where the records were burned at this time. Now we have also county and superior court records, the county court being the court of pleas and quarter sessions. And these records include things like dockets or bound volumes, which are summaries of proceedings, and also the loose papers of the court, which are the more fulsome, complete records of the court with regard to each case that it heard, which may or not be present, depending on the period of time and the county, but when you do find them, are exceedingly interesting and informative. These court records document things like illegitimacy, assignments to maintain roads, apprentice records for children with few prospects, poor relief, disputes between folks over land, which we often call ejectments, inheritance, debt, slander and trespass. Sometimes they document the full range of crimes from assault and petty theft to forgery, blackmail, murder, abuses against enslaved people, fornication, and adultery. And they may show relationships or call some assumed relationships into question. They're very useful for fleshing out the character of your ancestors, what they were like as people, what their habits were. Sometimes you can practically hear the voices of these people through their affidavits, what they sounded like, what their tone was. We find out who their friends and their enemies were, which may suggest blood relationships when you are at a loss otherwise. You don't expect to find full transcripts of court proceedings from the 19th century and before though. You find complaints and answers, summaries of actions taken by the court, names of witnesses called, and occasional written testimony. And to use them, it does require some knowledge of the law, but an hour or two of reading is usually enough to prepare you to interpret what you find. And a good law dictionary makes a difference when you come across a term you don't understand. If your ancestors were poor, these can be the most valuable types of records to help you piece together a possible family structure. Going is slow. It's mostly not digitized, although That's not the case with our civil action papers in North Carolina and our court minutes. Now they are digitized and are AI indexed. So that's a quick and easy way into the records if you can find it through that indexing. And because an individual who comes to court, his name is going to appear multiple times, it's going to get the name right. The AI is in indexing at least once in all the times those names appear. And gives you an entree into the records. Very, very useful. I'm very glad that Family Search has provided that capability among its current experiments with regard to its services. That's not true of the criminal case records, however. They have never been imaged, to my knowledge, and many of the summary dockets have not been imaged, so they're more difficult to get into, and you almost have to go to the archives to look at them at this point, or find some good abstracts or indexes. Very rewarding set of documents with patience. Really helps you put flesh on the bones, the dry bones of dates and names and places. Now this particular example that you see here is from 1793. And it's a written affidavit or testimony from Rachel Wallace in Richmond County, North Carolina, who says that she went with her brother about 3 or 4 weeks ago to her father Barnabas Skipper's corn crib, and they saw the head of a hog there that apparently her brother and some other men had stolen. Gives her brother his name as Needham Skipper, and some other people involved are mentioned, William Skipper and Solomon Quick. And it turns out, and also John Skipper, turns out that Solomon Quick was almost certainly married to one of the Skipper daughters in this family of Barnabas Skipper. And that was the only, well, one of several bits of information when put together that really suggested that connection, which DNA has subsequently strengthened. And here is another example of a court record, which is the coroner's inquest having to do with my great-great-grandmother Christine Quick's death, when she was overwhelmed by a fire that she was trying to put out in the brush near her cabin when her husband was away, and she had her little children there with her. All the people came and found her body afterwards. She wasn't burned, but she, I think, asphyxiated because she had a breathing problem from all the smoke. But all the people nearby were brought in, along with the coroner's jury, to give testimony about the circumstances of her death. Talks about their relationship, how her husband reacted, what the children said, and where they were. All very, very interesting and important. We have her gravestone. Her gravestone does survive next to her mother, but this just adds a whole new layer of poignancy and feeling to what happened leading to her death. And here's a record that was very important to me because I have a brick wall with my ancestor Aquila Johnson. In this record he's called Ack Johnson. And he's being summoned to court in a civil action for a small amount of money that he owes, $2.20 that he owes to George Patterson. And someone is called to give testimony named Duke Johnson. Now, I don't know who Aquila Johnson's father and mother and other siblings are, but this one record is the only record I've ever found associating him with someone of his age or older with his same name, Duke Johnson. Turns out DNA has proven since this was found that that indeed is a very close relative of his and probably his brother. So a very valuable civil court record. And then finally, we must not neglect records that are not in public domain, those that still belong or either generated by private entities or that belong to individuals, private citizens. And these include newspapers, records related to church membership, businesses, clubs, and associations, and records formerly belonging to individual family members. They may include lists of communicants, church discipline matters, birth, marriage, and death records, burials, transfers of membership, business and farming accounts, legal matters, including many involving enslaved people, journals, applications for membership, accounts, correspondence, and photographs. And they may contain very detailed and personal information. Much of this has been lost over the years, or it's still in private hands, so you may have to track down many other living descendants of an ancestor you're interested in and contact them to find what's still there. Now, some of this material has been donated to universities and public archives. You can use Archive Grid online to find some private collections related to your ancestors. Go to denominational or organizational archives websites and use their catalogs or correspond with the archivist. And sometimes they have finding aids up there too for individual collections. They're never complete. Some of them are digitized nowadays, but many of them are not going to be digitized. There are newspaper sites, however, like newspapers.com, Genealogy Bank, Find My Past, Chronicling America. All of those can help you find some newspapers. And Chronicling America is totally free. You may be able to get access to some of the others through your library or through our library. So this is an example of the private record that was found through a friend in Liberty, North Carolina, who wasn't even really related to this family, but had been collecting material from different people that she knew over many years related to genealogy. And she got this Bible record copied from a distant relative of mine about that same ancestor that the previous record I showed you was talking about is his family record. Now, he didn't write it because he was illiterate from what we know, but someone in the next generation probably wrote it. It gives his presumed parents' names, which I think are incorrect, and his wife's parents' names and their birth dates and when they got married, and all the children are listed below. When I first started doing my Kate's research, like those census entries I was telling you about earlier, I knew very little because of my great-grandfather's early death in 1911. We were not connected to this family of 16 children at all. We had a few photographs, but I was able to reach out to a whole list of people that I found by tracing them down through obituaries and through birth and death records in Durham County, North Carolina. I found out who a lot of the descendants of these 16 children were. I wrote a circular letter to all of them that I could find their addresses and asked for an interview or to share some of their information. And through that process, I got a tremendous number of photographs and stories that I recorded and made copies of. And this is one of the photographs. It shows my great-great-grandparents in front of their home in the edge of Duke Forest in Orange County, north of Chapel Hill. And this must be the day that my great-grandmother, Nora Cates, came with her children after her husband had died, their son. We can see that her little boys on the front porch standing behind the grandparents, and my own grandfather is in my great-grandmother's arms off to the left. Just priceless things you can get from distant family members that you can't get from any public archive. So many times people come into the library asking for the photographs that they can find on Ancestry. Well, for the most part, photographs are only going to come from private sources, with the exception of some military records and some applications for passports. For the most part, the only photographs we're going to find are going to be through our families that we have to really work to get. And here is a letter from a collection related to my Allred family that I found by searching through catalogs and Archive Grid, etc., for various archival holdings. This was held by Duke University. And there were 20, 25 little sheets of paper with different legal records and some personal letters. This one has to do with an enslaved person who was sold away from this Allred family to Georgia and was writing it back to find out what happened to her daughter, who was also sold away with her, was trying to get her former mistress to assist in reuniting with her because her present owner was willing to purchase the daughter. And that's pretty extraordinary. but there were some other extraordinary revelations about my Allreds, most of them not very positive in these records, that I found in a university archive. Now, there are far more kinds of records that I could cover, but I don't have time to cover. And I've made a start, you have to admit. It's possible that you may be able to get a bare structure of your immediate ancestors using online resources like census, probate, and vital records. But if you want to push your ancestry beyond 1850, when census records become less revealing, or get past some of the more common brick wall problems like illegitimacy, poverty, common surnames, unidentified maiden names for grandmothers, slavery, and family misinformation, or you want to flesh out the names and dates and make your ancestors come alive, to accomplish those goals, it will often be necessary to move beyond what is offered online. At least that's true at present. Just be aware that a lot of what is offered from the research of others is very questionable at best. And these days, because of the internet and family tree sharing, misinformation can travel and replicate at the speed of light. It may be correct, but if no one can tell you where the information came from, or if it doesn't come from a reliable original source record, like some of the source categories that we've talked about today, you can bet that there's a problem with it. It may not be completely incorrect, but there are problems. Secondhand information accepted uncritically can bring your research to a standstill. This is an example that doesn't come from the digital world, but it has been replicated across many different websites. It is so sticky, so hard to get rid of this misinformation because it was written in the 19th century history of Marlborough County, South Carolina, that my ancestor in the Adams family was named Jonathan, that he fought through the Revolutionary War as a Whig and didn't quite make it home and died on his way, left 3 sons, and those names are correct. And it talks about his son William in particular after that. Now, William is my ancestor, William Adams, but his father was not named Jonathan, and his mother was not named Mary. The records, the land records, many other records show that there was no Jonathan Adams resident in the area where he grew up, in fact. And yet there's a tombstone to Jonathan Adams, and many people have entered the DAR on that name based on this alone, this late 19th century history, which, giving all due credit to the author, who was a minister and a very, usually quite reliable person, he got this information indirectly from the family, and what they had done was simply transpose some names. So they didn't get it all wrong. They simply made a mistake. William Adams was married 4 times, as you see at the bottom of this snippet. His first wife was named Mary Marie, and the given names of her ancestors, her parents, were Jonathan Marine and Mary Charles. And indeed, those are the first names that whoever gave the information to the author, they transposed those maternal side given names of their maternal grandparents with the names of their paternal side grandparents, who were actually named William and Obedience Adams. So it's just a mistake, and people are so unwilling to let go of it now that it's transcribed in stone in a graveyard, and DAR people are dependent upon the accuracy of that record to be in the DAR. They're very loath to let go of it. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about our library. And you may not live anywhere close to us, but if you don't, there's likely a good library on a similar level somewhere in your neighborhood. Although, being prejudiced as I am, I will state, may not be quite as good as we are, but you should definitely take advantage of what they offer as well. And you can reach out to me and to us for some help if there's a particular question that you want some guidance on. Whether or not we might be able to help you is another matter to any great extent, but we can offer guidance, we can offer advice. Our unit is on the 2nd floor of the library. We're open all the regular hours except for Sundays and Monday evenings after 6 p.m. We are a reference collection, so nothing within our collection can be checked out within our reference part. But we don't require you to have a library card to use our collection or even the online resources when you're present at our facility. We simply ask that you sign in on arrival and that you don't reshelve materials, because when they're reshelved incorrectly, they can be missing for a long period of time until we actually happen across them again. Some of our items you should get assistance to use, like the research files or lock case items, but it is an enclosed, safe area of the library that is very peaceful, and we don't require people to be silent in here. We can't guarantee silence, but usually it's quite a safe, secure, and quiet place. We do offer access here on site to American Ancestors, the New England Historic Genealogical Society's website, to Heritage Quest, to Footnote, I'm sorry, that's Fold 3 now, and Ancestry.com. And we have reference subscriptions to newspapers.com, newspaperarchive.com, and Genealogy Bank. We now have access to Newsbank's newspaper archives for obituaries, Heritage Hub. We are a Family Search affiliate library, which means you can access many records in our facility that are restricted at home. And we offer more extensive, convenient hours than your typical Family Search center affiliated with an LDS stake. We are familiar with a variety of other websites, free and paid, that can meet your specific needs. Extensive local and family history files we have here for High Point, including indexes to our local newspaper that are pretty comprehensive, back 20 to 30 years in terms of local stories, and a complete obituary index of the High Point enterprise. We also have significant film holdings of lesser-known High Point papers, like The Beacon, which was sort of a gossip rag in our community. We have in the 50s and 60s primarily. We have extensive local records on microfilm for Guilford and neighboring counties, and digital microfilm readers, which allow you to enhance, alter, and save images to digital media or to print them after enhancing them. We have a 14,000 volume book collection focused on the Civil War, Revolutionary War, North Carolina topics, record abstracts from North and South Carolina counties, and colonial records from Maryland, Virginia, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. And currently we're working to beef up our holdings for early Tennessee counties and early Georgia counties. We now also have a lending collection, which you can check books out from, and which is located right outside our front doors on a metal rolling shelf, a shelving unit. And it's focused on recent titles in North Carolina history and culture and genealogy how-to that you can read at home at your leisure, where it's best to do such things. And there's no cost to getting a library card if you are within the area, even if you live outside of Guilford County now, which wasn't the case in the past. We have a large map collection of North Carolina related maps for various counties, some of which you cannot find online, and for High Point in particular, of course. And we offer personal librarian sessions, which are in-person, one-on-one help with your genealogy, 1 hour per day, if staffing and customer load don't interfere. And these sessions can be impromptu or scheduled. Even people researching ancestors in other states can get a start and advice about how to proceed further. Remember that considerable effort and travel may be required, and we will also be teaching you about the records themselves. And we can also do these by video or Zoom chat if you're not able to come in personally. We offer programs from August to May or June to teach you more about records and genealogy practice, as well as state, regional, and local history. Our Heritage Book Club, which is starting its 14th year, explores books about Southern social history or genealogy to give members context for their personal research. It's a lively, fun group, long about 15 to 20 people usually on any given topic. We do 3 topics a year. We read a book or a couple of books together and discuss them after each third or so or quarter of the book has been read. And it's one of my favorite parts of the job. And because we do these both in person now and on Zoom, you don't even have to be in our vicinity to participate in our book club.
You just have to obtain your own copy of the book if you aren't local. We also have 4-page resource guides available on our website to download on a wide array of record types and research problems. I think there are about 11 of those now. And of course, you know this because you're watching on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel, Heritage Deep Dive, and we try to post 4 to 6 new videos yearly. So those are many resources that you can use to jumpstart your genealogy. And also, you can reach out to us personally, and we will try to help you begin. And if you want more information on this overview, of course, there are multiple videos. There are research guides that focus in on particular aspects of what I've talked about today. And I wish you well on the beginning of your research journey.